Welcome back to the Weightlifting.ai podcast. I'm your host, Max Ada, and I am joined by none other than Gigglin' Gibson himself. There he goes. That's our anime intro there. We'll spice that up in post. Yeah. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah. We just had a great coffee from Phil's.
Yeah, Phil's
down the street.
Good
it was
friend
great.
Of ours. Phil's a well-known man in this area.
On Gilman, I think that's the last name.
Yeah,
that was really good.
So today I want to talk about a couple things, but primarily the first thing is I came across a post by Josh at Data Driven Strength, and there was an interesting line in there in the end, not the end of it, but he talked about, I guess the post was kind of covering some research about whether varied loads within training was potentially beneficial, or really was it detrimental to training for hypertrophy. If you didn't just train at the same basic intensity range,
right,
was there a benefit to that? And that was an interesting topic to me because it's one of those things where we talk a lot on the show, we talk a lot, you and I, about like variation and variety in our training and using different intensity ranges and rep ranges and these things. And it's kind of an interesting topic. So I wanted to kind of dive into that and get your opinion on it, and then, kind of go from there. So overall, did you read the study?
Yeah, I looked at the post. I think he was aggregating data from different studies and then just kind of like putting that together to show that when you just compare, like, I think he calls it like unimodal loading, right? Like high load or low load versus bimodal, I guess would be like both. There tends to be like a slight favor, and it tends to be slightly in favor of using both. Yeah. So like my thoughts ultimately would be, why are you building muscle in the first place?
Sure.
And then that kind of would drive the question of like, okay, if you're building muscle for performance, like then why would it be important to change up the loading or to have varied loading? And like when I hear about that, it's like comes back to the specificity of training for strength or like weightlifting performance in this scenario. So it's really cool if it's slightly in favor of kind of mixed loading, then that means you can also train with higher peak intensities.
Yeah.
And then integrate that within this framework of like knowing that hypertrophy is like very, very flexible and that it can be achieved with a bunch of different loads as long as they're taken close to failure, or like efforts equated. Then you can also make it more specific and take advantage of that and have a thread of that so that like when you sequence another training block right after it, you're not so out of practice.
Yeah. I think that's kind of one of the things that I latch onto when I was thinking about it, is the idea that you can have basically higher peak intensity. Right. And this is something that I don't think we don't really talk about a lot, or that doesn't get talked about a ton, I think, in a lot of like training discussions. I think people are intuitively using this or implementing the idea of increasing the peak intensity of training sessions, but it isn't always super explicit in people's conversations. And to me, when you look at especially like weightlifting, and this is kind of moving away from the hypertrophy discussion, but you talk about the idea of like, how can we incorporate higher peak intensities into training while at the same time, satisfying some of the other qualities we're trying to train in a general training block. So, what kind of methods can we use to do that? How can we find a way to establish, a spectrum of training intensities so we can accomplish the type of, goals we're looking to achieve, with technical mastery, or maybe we have some work capacity things we're trying to do. And at the same time, not shoot ourselves in the foot in that we are avoiding heavy weights so long that when we finally shift gears to the next training block, we have very little skill transfer, and then it becomes like this regression of your ability to touch heavy weights, and then you move into your strength block, and all of a sudden you've got 85-90% lifts regularly. And so as a means or a method, do you have preferred ways you would do that in programming, in like specific to weightlifting?
I do, and kind of off the back end of that point, I think, I don't know, probably plenty of people listening have made tremendous progress in a training block with like whatever they're measuring, right? So, if you want to use like more like official language, it'd be like with a certain KPI or like key performance indicator. And it's like, oh, we made tremendous progress. We're absolutely better in what we're measuring. And then they didn't like sequence it correctly, so it takes too long to try to like bring up what actually matters, which is like competition snatch and clean and jerk, and then you kind of start to lose the effect that you gained from all that hard training. So you're trying to balance like what's the residual of whatever we're improving, and then how well did we integrate it into training so we can turn it around and be prepared to use it immediately when like ultimately it's going to be at its peak. So if you take like block snatch above knee or hang below knee and you push it up really high, but you don't sequence it into training or integrate it into your training well, it's like the residual doesn't last long enough. So then you get back to like pushing the classics and it takes like 8 to 12 weeks, and then suddenly you're like, what was all that training for?
It's kind of a big, it's almost like a big knock on block periodization for weightlifting.
Right.
The more skill dependent it is, it seems like the more difficult or the more technique dependent your training is, especially where it's something that's as tactile as lifting maximum weights with high skill. Like the further away you move from that skill, the worse the transference will be, the worse the sequencing of training, the more critical the sequencing of training becomes. So, if you're a shot putter, like you have to basically throw the shot regularly enough that you don't lose the ability to throw a shot when you feel great. Because if you feel great and you go into your second training block, your strength block, your power block, whatever it is, and suddenly you're not throwing with high skill, all the training you did just doesn't transfer, and so that's like a definite, like, I think that's something that's common in weightlifting. I think there's also the opposite side of that, where people try to hold on to those fitness qualities way too long, way too much, right? So if you start your training cycle out and week number one you're doing Big Friday, it's like you may already be in a place where you're just essentially limiting what you're going to get out of that training block, because you're devoting a lot of energy to trying to keep your essentially sports skill at the highest level you can. Really at times just too far out, right? But if you spend time, sort of titrating that in at the proper dose, you can maximize basically the transition between phases of training, right? As far as like individual programming and training like that, are there things that you've done that you found to be an effective way to incorporate basically peak singles or high intensity singles into training, and ways you've also done it that you felt have been ineffective?
And we kind of talked about this, and this might be slightly off course from your question, but like we like talked, it was like you, Joe, myself, and a couple of the other coaches.
Name dropping the old ball and chain on here isn't going to get you any extra credit, Josh.
We talked about like integrating hypertrophy specific training into a weightlifter's program, and a lot of that is like recognizing what's specifically or solely for building muscle, and then like being able to integrate that with things that are not just for building muscle, but also like you can't parse out the effect of snatching, clean and jerking, squatting, and all the accessory work with like, my hypertrophy specific training. Like you can't differentiate those things. There aren't like separate like adaptational buckets where it's like, well, this is for hypertrophy and this is not. Because
a few reps here and they go in that bucket, and a few reps there.
And it's like, okay, so it should be fine. And it's like, it's all going to the same place, right? It's all feeding into the same mouth.
Do you think that hypertrophy is a state of mind?
I would say that
I once did an 8-hour arm workout, Rich Piana style. It was the Bulgarian 8-hour arm workout, and it definitely felt like it was all in my mind. Like the hypertrophy effect.
Like you had the ultimate mind-muscle connection.
That's what I'm talking about. I think that's what it is.
If you just believe it, I think you'll grow as much as you possibly can.
I feel bigger right now.
You look smaller.
Well, okay.
Must be all the running.
So Yeah, so I guess then as far as actual implementable methods.
Yeah.
And when I say methods, I think we both are on the same page. Like, what is the actual structure of the training day or the session or whatever? Do you find, I think we've talked about this before, where the idea of like having people do a top set and then back off sets. Yeah. That's super common in strength training. It's super common in powerlifting, weightlifting to some degree as well. With like strength and hypertrophy directed training, right? Like if we're doing, squatting or general movements. In Olympic weightlifting, I feel like in the snatch and clean and jerk, there's this issue where people will do like a top single and then drop sets.
Yeah.
And ultimately always have a worse training session because of it.
Yeah.
Right? Versus like the other way around, where you'd have like a pyramid up where you do like, 3x3, 3x2, 3x1, and then a single.
Yeah.
Right? Because, it's like the improvement in technical quality as you work up in the session does favor having a better single at the end versus working up to your first single and then coming down, and suddenly there's such a drastic change in the way the bar feels and the weight and everything. It like those first few sets are almost wasted.
Yeah.
You ever notice that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't recount the number of times where I've had like 15 singles on the minute. I took it up after my last few and then hit, snatch 120, and I hadn't snatched that in I don't know how long, or like hang snatch 120 for the first time after a bunch of singles on the minute. I think the important thing is like recognizing what you need ultimately. So it's like there's value in peak intensity, but some people don't thrive on like that immediate like push to a single and do drop sets. Like and I'm thinking of maybe like smaller females definitely don't. Yeah. Where they tend to do better after volume work, and then it's like, hey, let's bump up the last few. And that's the way the AI works, is by generally starting someone off at a particular load. They perform the lift, they rate it, it's 3 whites, and then it can start to take them up. And they get like more technical work, they kind of feel things out. So it almost has like this potentiating effect. And I find that generally with weightlifting, most people don't handle heavy enough weights, so they get super fatigued super fast.
So it's almost not necessary, right?
Yeah, it's almost not necessary. It's more so like, at what point in the workout can you get to that peak intensity? And then what do you do with the rest of the volume? I think most people kind of towards the end of their work sets can kind of push up and push into it, and then that's going to kind of raise the average weight on the bar and keep the quality higher versus working up to something, trying to force it, and then dropping down, not having a bar feel at all, and then trying to like make sure it happens. Yeah,
it's a good method. That like a pyramid is a good method because it does all those things. It allows you to have a high peak intensity. It allows you to accomplish a large amount of volume. Right? You can do a significantly larger amount of volume that way than you could if it was all straight sets at the same average intensity. And then at the same time, it allows you to practice the sports skill at varied intensities. So you get exposure to controlling the bar in, with a different level of input, right? 60, 70, 75, 80%, all in the same session versus just having all the sets across at the same weight.
Well, I think the trap people run into, and this is, I think it's kind of like this, it's a slightly more narrow way of thinking about it, is people, and because I do this with the strength work, we'll do, say I don't want someone to do a really, really heavy set on week 1 and just crush it and then like struggle on week 2. So we'll do a pyramid up. And we'll almost like want them to be slightly fatigued and make it feel a little harder, so that on week 2 or week 3.
If you're hearing the car alarm, that's how you know we're in Oakland. This is an authentic podcast coming to you straight from the heart of the Bay.
Yeah, well, I remember multiple times when I was getting ready to move out, Max proceeded to remind me of the gunshots that happened when he was sitting out in his hot tub in his backyard.
This is how we knew we were desensitized, is because we were sitting in, it used to be when there'd be gunshots when I first moved here, Joanne, my wife, would be like, let's, get down, like duck, like go, you hear some gunshots, she'd be like, go to the back of the house. Now it's when we're in the hot tub and we hear gunshots. It was a shootout, for sure. It was a shootout. There was a small arms fire going back and forth, and it was probably like 5 blocks away. And we look at each other and are like, I mean, they're far enough away. Should we get out? I'm like, no, let's just hang out and we'll wait. And then we did. And so that's when you know you're acclimated. It's like a war zone. It's like a war zone here.
Yeah, that's right. So like ultimately, what I was getting at is, people think that you need to do a top set immediately to preserve the quality, and then you do drop sets because you're going to be tired from it. And I think it's a function of work capacity.
Yeah.
Like all these things are a function of work capacity. So do you build to a top set immediately without doing any volume beforehand? That's one strategy, and I'll do that on like test weeks to get like the purest form of what they can do. But generally, I'll have people build into heavy sets and accumulate work beforehand, and they become conditioned to that. So it's not actually like a problem.
Yeah.
So I think, thinking of this concept of work capacity, which is probably one of the most important qualities to develop in an athlete or a weightlifter, is something that like prioritize that, then prioritize intensity, and then you can kind of move from there versus like intensity is the only thing.
Yeah.
Because if you always prioritize intensity, you're probably going to be slightly undertrained. You're going to be trying to shove a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah.
Quality is going to go down. So it's like, okay, preserve quality, preserve the work capacity, then try to drive intensity up. And then you can test when you understand like, okay, we've actually developed something instead of testing every week, beating your head against the wall.
Yeah, and some other like practical methods that make sense would be like, so we have like pyramids, which is essentially, you have, the way I would define that would be like multiple sets in the same zone, and then jumping to the next zone for another round of sets that potentially is different reps, or it might be a different movement. You might have like a complex that's like, power clean, push, press, jerk, and then it moves to power clean, jerk, then it moves to, max power clean, max jerk. And so you reduce the number of reps as you work up intensities, as we always do usually. The other kinds of methods that I think allow us to achieve a little bit higher peak intensity with the same accomplishment of getting work done, if we took that same amount of work and instead of had it building like a mountain where it's layer on layer, we'd have waves, right? So you'd have like one wave up, you do 70 for triple, 75 for a triple, 80 for a double, 85 for a single. Then you come back down, you do 77, 83, 88, 91, right? Whatever it is, you build up slowly that way, and you can have multiple waves. Using multiple waves is kind of nice in that you might encounter situations with lifters where that's going to be practical.
Right.
They get into a competition. Let's say it's the AO, it's the Olympics. It's the AO2 in Pleasanton, California. You're in the M session and there's 21 lifters all with the exact same total.
Right.
You open up, first, and then 21 guys have to take, or 20 guys have to take that same number. You're going to go up and down. Right?
Yeah.
You have to be conditioned enough to do those things. It's a specific type of session because you're trying to, build work capacity, so you have the fitness to do it, and you can train with enough volume to get better, but also the ability to come back down to lighter weights and then go back up to heavier weights again. Something that's funny is, and kind of a tangent to that is, in the back room, we see a lot of people, they might take an opener and then have to wait a long time, and everybody has a different strategy for what they do in the back, right? They go back, they do a pull, they do a power clean, they do a whatever, and then they go back and they do their second attempt, and that's to stay warm.
Right.
I've never seen anyone, I'm sure someone's done it, but I've never seen it where anyone's programmed training like that. Where like, as you get close to a meet, you like, oh, we're gonna do your opener snatch, then let's drop down to 70% for a single, and then let's do 5 kilos
take
more.
A power.
Do a power, then come back. And so it's like, because I've never seen it programmed, I oftentimes wonder if there's any real benefit to it.
Yeah.
Like it's a weird, it's probably largely psychological, right? I don't think there's a change in, maybe there's some definite changes in like the activation and like, like how potentiated you are going onto the platform, and like your excitation level is maybe changed. So there's definitely you lose the edge maybe.
Right.
But like there's no real physiological thing happening. Like you don't lose the contractile proteins, like they just disappear. And I've got personal experience having done like big lifts completely cold, no warm up. And like it's terrifying, but like all of the parts of my body were still there. Like I should be able to do it. It's just a matter of like, do I have the feel for it, the technical, like tactile sort of like, can I do the snatch well? And so those methods of like going up and down. As far as outside of like pyramids and waves, what else do you do, or what have you done?
Yeah, I would say something that's more like on the minute work, which is kind of like a pyramid, but it's more kind of staggered
like an escalating set,
peak.
right?
Yeah, like an escalating set. And then honestly, a lot of it can be, a pyramid is like a defined structure.
Yeah.
And it looks very symmetrical. Whereas kind of the way we coach, and I think most people listening coach is, it's like, hey, you look good, go up.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know at what point that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe it's at the end, it's like, oh, you're done. It's like, let's add a few sets.
Right.
Let's add a few sets and see what you can do.
Yeah.
So it ends up looking more like a molehill than a pyramid. But to that point too, about doing things in competition you've never done in training before, I think that's where this idea that it can kind of get lost on people's like minimum effective dose.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the least I need to do to get better? Like, why do more than that? And I think to your point, the whole work capacity idea of being able to take lifts in the back and be in shape and then come back out on the comp platform and put it together. So I think just being able to repeat maximal efforts and then also thinking about that as being like the most specific practice. So in training, being able to do that too. Yeah. It's like, okay, you can improve and get better doing minimal amounts of work, but how much better could you be if you could repeat that 2 more times, 3 more times, 4 or 5 more times? And I mean, you kind of developed like a highly specific work capacity when you were training. Yeah. So do you think you could have, well, do you think if you were better, you would have been like a killer in competition because you'd just be able to take so many heavy singles?
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing weightlifting, it was never like, there was never a fitness quality issue. It was always a technical issue. Yeah. Right. But the other side of that coin is like not having the general like work capacity and general fitness to just train like a weightlifter should train with like sets and reps and like a voluminous program. Yeah. Like that definitely limited me. It was also a problem of like, we talked about this earlier, is like the idea of trying to hold on to this peak intensity. Yeah. You're just all the time, everything is focused on, can I do my heavy singles today? And as soon as you add some doubles or triples into your program, whoa, that number comes down. Yeah. Fatigue actually becomes a real thing. Yeah. You don't get tired doing singles, right? So then it suddenly becomes this battle between like, well, doubles and triples make you worse. Or it's like, it's just wasted energy because now you can't even do your, you can't even miss 110 10 times today, right? Like you're, like last night you missed it 5 times. Today you're not even able to get there. Yeah. But when you actually come down to this mid-range where like the bulk of your training is a lot of volume and a lot of like moderate to heavy intensities, between 70 and 90%, like that's where the bulk of training occurs. Right. If you do that and you speckle in high intensity lifts, high peak intensity sessions, you basically accomplish the things you need to, right? We maintain our skill, maintain a touch and a feel for those high intensity lifts, and you can develop all the other qualities you need to with the bulk of training that you're doing. The one thing that 90% lifts and high intensity lifts like that can't do is build work capacity, and there's just not enough, you're not gonna do enough volume of them to really drive much strength adaptation, right? Yeah. So you kind of are trapped if you stay there too long, right?
Because your movement's going to start falling apart.
Yeah, and then then what happens is you oftentimes become like dependent on trying to find a new technical change because it's the only thing that gives you a little bit of a stimulus. Right. Yeah. So it's like, okay, I'm doing this heavy lifts all the time, and then you hear that everybody just gets into this thing of like, I'm trying this thing with my hips, a new start position today, move my feet out, move this, change that, and it's like, well, all of your technique was fine yesterday, and then all of a sudden you need to like change it to get something more out of it. Yeah. We had a little discussion the other day, but like technique is like finite. Yeah. There's a point at which you'll have maximum efficient technique, and then it's always an output problem. Right. Weightlifting is always a strength power output problem. Yeah. If you can't generate enough force fast enough and translate that into a good snatch, like it doesn't, that's it. Yeah. You have to be able to generate the force to lift the bar high enough. Yeah. Right. Your technique is going to be the ability to utilize your physical qualities. Yeah. But it doesn't change or improve on anything beyond a limit. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's like ultimately it's about, so if we think of performance as a function of like pure output, and then also like the fit on the spout or the faucet, right? It's like, can you get as much of a flow as possible, and then it's like, how strong is the flow?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's ultimately what technique's about. And I think you can easily get caught in this trap of like, oh, we're gonna get so much from these technical changes, and it's like, oh, but you're gonna be as strong as you are now when the technique's better.
Yeah.
And that means you're gonna be limited by that still.
The one caveat to that though is that it's very easy to be in a situation where your technique is holding you back from successful lifts.
Right. Oh, right? Sure.
And so like there's this range where it's like, oh, your technique is good enough to lift more weight, but it's not good enough to be consistent in a competition.
Right.
You're missing lifts because you're missing them because your position is wrong or timing is wrong, right? And so like that's, pressing out jerks is like, yeah, you have to fix errors that prevent you from being successful.
Yeah. How often do you think that the technical errors are a function of like output problems?
I think there's probably a pyramid, right? It's probably the base level of most technical errors come from, just poor practice.
Yeah.
People are not practicing the right way, or they're not practicing enough, or they're just not doing that portion of the lift correctly.
Right.
And then the second layer is probably like general strength quality issues.
Yeah.
Right. Like you can't get into that position with this much load. Right. And so you need to train yourself to do that.
Right.
That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. That's it for us. If you guys are interested in any kind of following of the two of us, you can find Josh on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL. That's PHIL, not his first name. You can also go for remote coaching. You can find Josh at philosophicalweightlifting.com, or you can check out this will come out quite a bit earlier than it's going to come out, but the coaches only through Weightlifting House. They're bringing it back. 7 speakers. Most of them don't know anything about weightlifting. They're just going to bullshit you, but it's worth $200. No, it's going to be great. Top people. We've got Kyle Pierce, yourself,
Jim Rudder.
Who's
coached like tons of people now.
Yep. He won't steer you wrong.
He will not.
That was a dad joke.
Yeah.
Let it sink in.
Rudder.
Let it sink in. There you go. And then we have, who else is on there?
Dr. Kyle Travis, who's studied tapering and peaking for weightlifting. He's done case series for weightlifting.
Yep, he's going to peak for this one, I hope.
This is his peak.
This is it.
This is his Olympics.
Is the top.
This is everyone's Olympics. And then we have Kyle Pierce.
I said Kyle Pierce.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Did you remind everyone that he developed 3-time Olympian Kendrick Ferris?
He did. Yes, very true. He's had a super successful program at LSU.
Yeah. He's a great guy.
He is a great dude. He's a great guy. He kind of coaches Ghana now, I believe.
He does.
Yeah.
Sounds like a Ghana.
Yeah. He's been everywhere.
Yeah.
And then that's 6. Who's the 7th?
And then Kevin Simons, who's developed a world medalist.
Yeah.
Bronze medalist at Worlds. And youth and junior medalists.
His talk will be interesting. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Excited to hear his.
Yeah.
And then one more.
And then we are waiting for the last person to confirm. Yeah.
Okay.
So we have one
mystery
last
guest.
mystery speaker.
Mystery speaker. We have no idea.
And then we have a roundtable, which will be Kyle Pierce, myself, and Jim.
Nice.
And we'll just chat programming and training.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And then you can find me on Instagram at max_Ada. You can find my remote coaching or consultations at teamada.com. If you're not doing it right now, you fucking should be. The Weightlifting.ai app, it is the best training app that's ever been made for weightlifting. It is head and shoulders above everything else that exists right now. Get yourself off a shitty template, get yourself off whatever terrible program that you found in the gutter, and get yourself on a real program with a fantastic, I would say, cohort of people behind you. You've got myself, Josh in the community, you've got Seb, you got all of Weightlifting House,
Daniel Francis.
We have people moving forward, making things happen. It's exciting. Get on it. We'll see you next time.